Morning, councillors. Please be seated. Good morning to members of the public watching online and those in the public gallery. Can I remind everyone to mute their devices? Councillor Robertson. Thank you. And if you can ensure that all mobile phones are also muted or switched off. We have rough timings outlined on your procedural note for today, and we will do our best to stick to them, and to a degree that is in your hands. I'm going to ask the clerk to confirm any apologies and take a roll call of those joining online.
Morning, Provost, morning, members. We have no formal apologies for today's meeting. In terms of those members who are online, I understand that we have Bailey Ahern. Can you confirm that you're present?
I am. Good morning.
And Councillor Kogali?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning.
I'm not aware of any other members who are online, and all others are present in the chambers.
Sorry, Clerk. I think Councillor Anderson, unless he's arrived in the last minute or two, was stuck in traffic, but he's making his way here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Members, item 2 is declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations of interest they wish to declare in respect of items on today's business? I don't see any declarations of interest. Therefore, item 3.1 in notice of petitions urge Perth Kinross to build an ambitious PH2O facility. The main petitioner is unable to attend council this morning and therefore has provided a written statement which Mr Hendry will read to council.
Thank you, Provost. Yes, this is on behalf of Mr Bobby Bryan, who was the lead petitioner, who was hoping to phone into the meeting but unfortunately now can't make it. So there follows a statement that I'm going to read verbatim, which is entirely the words of Mr Bryan, and it begins as follows. Councillors, thank you for the time and opportunity to contribute to today's council meeting. Unfortunately, due to work commitments, I am unable to speak to you face to face. I have written this speech to address a matter of great importance to many people, the decision by this council to replace the current Perth Leisure Pool and Dure Centre with a new facility at Thimble Row Car Park. I and many others firmly believe that this decision is misguided and does not serve the best interests of our community. First and foremost, Perth Leisure Pool and the Dure Centre are not simply just buildings, they are integral parts of our community and its heritage. For decades, these facilities have been the beating heart of recreational and social activities in Perth. They have hosted countless events, from essential swimming lessons for our children to curling competitions and internationally renowned conferences. Replacing these iconic facilities with an inferior facility at Thimble Row would erase a significant part of our local history and its identity. It will also severely hinder the economic prosperity of Perth and the county as a whole. While the proposals for the new facility at Thimble Row may be well intentioned, they fall woefully short of meeting the new comprehensive needs required by those that use the facilities. The proposed facility at Thimble Row includes provision for a 25-metre lane swimming pool, a teaching pool, toddler splash pad, sports hall and a fitness gym. However, it alarmingly lacks many facilities that would make it suitable for the local community and would make it a world-class flagship facility that the people of Perth and Kinross can be proud of. Let me remind you that the council itself promised and once described the PH2O as a one-stop 21st century flagship facility. You have to ask, was this a promise that the council never intended on keeping? To remind you all of how unpopular the Thimble Row facility is, the following parties have publicly condemned the council's current plans for the Thimble Row facility. 3 highly respected former chairmen of Live Active Leisure, David McElhose, Mike Robinson and Bill Duncan, a serving Live Active director, Bob Braun, a former Live Active board member, David Longmuir, the Courier, multiple MSPs including Murdo Fraser and Liz Smith, the Provost of the Council, Bailey, award-winning Perth City Swim Club champion Anne Dixon, champion curler and Olympian Eve Muirhead, the Perth Civic Trust, Perth City Curlers and Perth Indoor Bowling Club. The aforementioned have for some time campaigned or requested that PH2O includes provision for a dedicated leisure pool, freeing up the training pool for use by clubs and professionals. The currently used and proven model at Perth Leisure Pool, which includes both a leisure and training pool, sees high utilisation throughout the year. Leisure water and flumes are enjoyed by thousands of adults and kids who travel from far and wide to experience the thrill of the current facilities. The proposed 8-lane 25-metre pool at Thimble Row sees drastic reductions in leisure swimming provision. Leisure swimming with features would be cut by more than 30 hours per week. This backed on mock timetables drafted by the council for how they could cram all activities into a pool not designed to cope. The facilities asked for in the petition are as a minimum what is required for PH2O. They are not luxuries, merely essentials for promoting health, well-being and sporting participation in Perth and Kinross. The council argues that the Thimble Row option is more cost-effective, with a capital cost of $61 million compared to the $105 million for the Glover Street site. However, this analysis is short-sighted and unfounded. Investing in a more ambitious facility at Glover Street, as proposed by the petition, will yield significant long-term economic benefits. A state-of-the-art facility with a wider range of amenities would attract more visitors, not only from Perth but also from surrounding areas. The increased footfall would boost the custom of local businesses, create jobs and stimulate local economic growth. The higher initial investment would be offset by the sustained economic activity generated by a more attractive and comprehensive facility, something that the council and its consultants have failed to take account for. Building a more ambitious facility at Glover Street is not just about meeting our current needs, it's about future-proofing our infrastructure. As our community grows and evolves, so too will the demand for high-quality recreational facilities. By investing today in a comprehensive facility, we can avoid the need for costly upgrades or expansions in the future. This proactive approach aligns with the Council's long-term strategic goals of enhancing the city, as well as the quality of life for local residents and making Perth an attractive destination for both residents and tourists. The Glover Street site offers many strategic advantages that the Thimble Row site does not. It is more accessible to residents and visitors, making it a more convenient location for a major recreational facility. The site is located a stone's throw away from the city's bus and railway stations. Connecting seamlessly with public transport is essential for connectivity. Experts have highlighted the cost-saving benefits of co-locating a pool facility and ice rink on the same site by the use of thermal engineering. The Council's decision to avoid disruption to existing facilities during construction is understandable, but temporary solutions can be implemented to minimise inconvenience whilst ensuring the long-term benefits of a better located facility are realised. To put it simply, the evidence presented to elected officials regarding this matter is insufficient and in some cases fundamentally flawed. It appears that the viewpoints not aligning with the Council's agenda have either been excluded or suppressed. Furthermore, the overall lack of consultation by both Perth and Kinross Council and Live Active Leisure reflects a culture of neglect and poor communication. In conclusion, the people of Perth and Kinross are tired and fed up of dithering by multiple council administrations. They were promised over a decade ago a one-stop 21st century flagship facility, and contempt has been shown to the people of Perth at every opportunity since. Time and again, some, not all elected officials, have willingly neglected and turned their back on the people of Perth and Kinross when it mattered most, and have revealed themselves as untrustworthy and not willing to listen to the general public who they are meant to serve. In September of last year, councillors, namely Deputy Provost Barrett, Bayliss McLaren and Williamson, Liz Barrett, Peter Barrett, Carr, Donaldson, Drysdale, Frampton, Harvey, Lang, McPherson, Massey, McCall, McEwen, Rebeck, Robertson, Stewart, Waters and Welsh voted for the motion in relation to Standing Order 21.5 to progress plans for a new PH2O facility at Thimble Row Car Park. The councillors whose names were just read out have assisted in signing the death sentence for the City of Perth and its sporting future. You may not care, but the people of today and future generations will remember your names and the legacy you have unfortunately bestowed upon Perth. In my opinion, the people who know what's best for the local area are the people who live and work in the local area and make it very clear the people of Perth say no to Thimble Row. Thank you for your time and attention. Please consider your decision and let us come together to build a brighter future for Perth. End of the statement.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Obviously, as the petitioner is not present, it's not possible to question the petitioner. There will be questions to officers at the next stage when the officer paper is introduced. We now move on to item 3.2, Save Our Rural Libraries, petition, which is going to be represented by Ms. Hannah Wicks. Ms. Wicks, if you'd like to come forward to the podium and the Deputy Provost will raise his hand when you have 1 minute to go, okay? Sorry, just before you start, Ms. Wicks, just 2 seconds. The Leader of the Council.
I think it's only fair that I'll stand up for all elected members within the council on that statement. It's very unfortunate that the petitioner wasn't here to. I'd certainly have some questions about his statement about us holding in contempt and signing death knells, etc. like that. I find it's a very unfair statement on everyone. He said all political parties and across the chamber do not act and are untrustworthy. I don't think that we can accept that without comment. I'm sure everybody within the chamber would have liked to have a chance to challenge the petitioner of some of what he said. I'm not dismissing, but the blatant attack that we'd come in here daily to try and work for the people of Perth and Kinross within a budget, I find really insulting. So I just wanted to make that my comment on behalf, if everybody agrees with me or not. I don't care. I'm arguing for everybody in this chamber. We come in here and do our best within a budget envelope. Thank you.
Thank It's not a reflection on our
My
views on
comment
what
was on his views, not on what on anybody else.
Indeed. Okay. Ms. Wicks, you may now proceed with a maximum of 10 minutes, and the Deputy Provost will raise his hand when you have 1 minute to go. Okay.
Right. Hi, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be able to address you today on behalf of quite a diverse group from Save Our Rural Libraries. Some of us are here today, others are still completing the school run. There is a reason I'm here, and I wish I wasn't here. I could read the letter that you have all received, I hope. It was primarily written by Octorata, but addresses all of us and our concerns on the closure and potential closure of the 5 rural libraries in question. I have 10 minutes now to talk to you about why those libraries matter. I think all of you are probably aware of the proposed budget put forward, which hopefully will save those libraries and provide additional funding. Our request as Save Our Rural Libraries is that we have multi-year funding, that we have sustainable rural services that are resilient. So these 5 libraries, some of them have been around longer than the National Library of Scotland, and we want to preserve those places and those spaces for our communities. When it comes to the wards that will be affected, 3 wards would completely lose all physical spaces to their libraries. 1 would have 1 remaining library left. It is a huge challenge for us to be able to focus down and go, okay, why do these libraries matter? How much are they used? The usage of libraries has been increasing since the pandemic. We're not quite at the level we were pre-pandemic. There are digital services that are also accessed through these libraries. One of the things that is the biggest challenge is how we make these libraries accessible to communities. How do we increase the footfall? What does that look like? And some of you are probably asking, how much do these libraries actually cost us right now? So currently in Perth and Kinross, we have 12 libraries. There were 13. Cooper Angus is already closed. In total, the budget you're asking to review is quite substantial. When we look at actually what these libraries cost, we're looking at around just under 200,000 a year. The estimates, we've had different numbers, it's around 170,000. They're already running quite lean services. Some of them, 3 of them are only open around 9-10 hours a week. They spread the hours they're open over Thursday, Friday and Saturday. Some run more days. The equivalent staff for these 5 rural libraries is roughly around 3 full-time equivalent staff. Right now, Culture Perth and Kinross have a sizable budget. They're obviously under immense strain, but this budget for these 5 libraries represents just 3% of the annual budget of Culture Perth and Kinross. So what we're asking you is to look at these 5 libraries and consider, can we afford as a community to keep them open? So the towns that these libraries are in, so we have Burnham, which obviously serves Dunkeld and Burnham, we have Scone, we have Octorata, we have Alyth, and we have Comrie. They represent roughly 10% of the population of Perth and Kinross, but yet it's costing just 3% of Culture Perth and Kinross's budget to keep these open. Okay, so what happens when you close a library? it's quite fitting that we actually have an example of this, and that's Cooper Angus. So I picked up the phone to see what that has been like for them. There's reasons why this library didn't reopen after the pandemic. One of the reasons, it was housed in the town hall, there were considerable structural damages, a community centre was opening. Great, let's look at alternative solutions for the library. So there was a transfer of stock. Culture Perth and Kinross no longer provided the service. The stock was transferred into the community building. It was not listed on any of the computers and not searchable. You can't order books to that library and access them directly. Currently, the visitor numbers of that space where those books, those dead stock books are housed, has around 20 people visit a month. 2 children in the past year have been in that library. That library was receiving between 1,000 to 1,500 footfall visits a year prior to the closure. Communities are now having to travel to other towns to access books, or they're not accessing them at all. That community space is also shut, and that library is under immense threat and now gone. So one of the big questions we have is around fundraising. Were they able to fundraise to access that space? They were not able to fundraise. They were not able to find any external funding to keep that library space open. I also had a chat to Lochleven. They run obviously a great library there, and they face closures on certain days. And that library is not one of the ones at risk, but I chatted with the Friends of Lochleven Library to understand more about what the fundraising means there and what the challenges they've had to be able to bring volunteers to open that library on a Saturday and a Monday. And what they found is they need around 20 volunteers to run the library open for 5 hours. One of the requirements from Culture Perth and Kinross is that all those volunteers must have labels marking them clearly as volunteers. They also must pay insurance costs to the council via Culture Perth and Kinross in order to be able to volunteer in that space. They must also always have more than one volunteer in the space in order to provide that service. And volunteer staff have to do 2 forms of training. It takes quite a lot. They're willing volunteers, but it takes a lot to organise that group, and they have been running for 5-6 years. In terms of funding, they're able to fundraise around £300 a year. If that library were to shut, they have very strong doubts that they would be able to keep the space open. In terms of local business funding, which is one of the first things you turn to when you're like, how do you support a space like this? Local business funding has significantly dropped as things have got tougher on local businesses. Another source of funding and an option is to turn to local grants and foundation groups. As most of you probably know, under the Local Governments Act, it is a requirement to provide a library service to communities, an adequate library provision. What this means is it's very hard to fundraise against that. An example I looked at was Foundation Scotland. So they're one of the biggest funders out there, the Scotland's Community Foundation. J.K. Rowling's trust, for example, is managed by Foundation Scotland. She would be a natural fit to help fund libraries as she is resident within Perth and Kinross. Unfortunately, they do not fund anything that is statutory requirement under law for local government to provide. So what we would do by turning these libraries over to communities, whether they're community or volunteer-led, is create a fundraising hurdle that is almost impossible for the communities to meet. So that's one of the fundraising challenges. I'm open to questions on other ways that we can look at fundraising, but my background is in fundraising, and it is a significant challenge to turn this over to communities. And it's something that also Culture Perth and Kinross has been attempting to do for these local communities and their libraries. One of the other pieces is obviously, what do libraries bring? And these spaces, these 5 rural libraries, represent one of the few community spaces left in those towns. So they don't necessarily have the same access to culture that those in Perth do, or those in Kinross do, for example. They also represent warm spaces. They present spaces where you can access and socialise. A library at its peak serves individuals during different points in their life cycle. You're far more likely to access the library when you are a toddler and in primary school. You're far more likely to access the library when you're more elderly. It's similar to a health services. There are points in your life where you need to be accessing that service, and it won't always be more consistent. All of these libraries, for example, have book bugs. they're oversubscribed. There is a waiting list to attend, and that is an immense service for local mums, parents, and also other carers in the community. A number of these libraries also host the nursery visits. This kind of footfall isn't necessarily measured in the statistics and numbers on the table. And they represent a way to engage children and communities with literacy and opportunity. I'm open to questions on libraries. There's a lot I now know, which I didn't expect to. It's a very diverse group of campaigners, individuals, local families, and residents who've come together across the 5 communities. It's the first time some of us have ever actually coordinated across different wards. So it's been a fascinating experience. Yes, so in total, to summarise, the budget we're looking at for these 5 libraries is actually under 200,000. It's 3 full-time staff. Currently, there's around 50 full-time staff employed by Culture, Perth and Kinross over library and information services. It's a small fraction. Questions?
You have 1 minute left if you wish to use any.
Yeah, let's pivot to questions. Let's do it.
Okay, thank you very much for your statement, Ms. Wicks. Members, do you have any questions for Ms. Wicks and the Save Our Rural Libraries petitioners? I have a question from Councillor Bob Braun and then a question from Councillor Angus Forbes. So, Councillor Braun.
Thanks, Provost, and thank you for your presentation. I think it'd be fair to say that we all understand the importance of libraries, but I just wanted to ask you what you see the future of. Yeah, we talk about libraries. The first thing we think about is you borrow a book, you read it, you take it back, you borrow the next book. When I was younger, that's what the libraries did. There was a notice board up saying there's the local things on. Libraries have evolved, obviously, and changed. We have a digital time now. People have electronic books and get that very cheaply. I just wonder, what do you see as the future of libraries? It sounds from what you were saying that you see it generating more to a community hub than the books almost phasing out, really. Is that what your thoughts would be?
I think as an interesting perspective, I would never say that we're probably going to phase out books. I think the way we access knowledge and increase literacy rates is always hopefully going to include books. I do think it's interesting looking at Culture, Perth and Kinross's strategy around having bigger library hubs, whether they're in Blairgowrie, whether they're in Breadalbane, whether they're in Perth is interesting. My question is, why can't we have small rural hubs? And when you look at what we can do with those spaces, like across Perth and Kinross, we have 900 volunteer groups. Why aren't we using these spaces to host their AGMs and their charity meetings? It's a warm space the council is already providing the roof for. And then when I look at the upskilling of these local communities, one of the biggest challenges, particularly for rural communities, is around education opportunities. If you take a child who's living in a regional area who wants to access the ability to go to Code Club and learn languages like Python, they have to travel over 30 minutes to get to that centre in Breadalbane. Why couldn't we have pop-up rotating code academies or code clubs for children in these 5 rural libraries? And to that matter, why can't we also run the film club that runs at AKO Bell, the Environment Film Club? Why can't we have a version of that in local communities? And to your point around books in the future, I think there's been some really interesting things tested by Culture, Perth and Kinross. One example is the Seed Library. Why we have huge enthusiastic gardening communities within these regions, why couldn't we be running a version of the Seed Library between these libraries? Why can't we have a tool library that exists, for example, in Crieff? These kind of things could greatly increase the value the council gets from these spaces. I do think we need to innovate. And if there's anything this group has shown me, it's that we want to innovate, we want to collaborate, and we do think these spaces can offer more to the community. And I think we're already running the leanest possible version with a lot of these libraries. My question is, how can we use any of these funds to actually increase the value the council and the communities get back? And this does need to be in consultation with those communities. It also needs to be in consultation with those librarians. And we want these libraries to be professionally staffed. Under the volunteer charter, you shouldn't be able to remove a paid staff member and replace them with a volunteer. And that's something that Perth and Kinross Council has signed up to. So it's really disappointing to see, oh, these will be community or volunteer-led spaces. Some of these librarians, like Mags, our librarian, has been there over a decade. The reason we got 5,600 signatures is because there are young adults in that community who signed that petition because they were like, Mags is my librarian. And when I have kids, I want to be able to take them to that library. And I want them to grow up and I want them to have access to books. I want them to be able to choose the books. I don't want them to be timed, that they have to leave after 15 minutes because the mobile library has to get off to the next stop. These are spaces that have, in some cases, 140-year precedent of being in these communities. And I don't see why we should suddenly take them away.
Thank you very much. Before I come to Councillor Forbes, can I ask all members, please, to make sure the microphone is right in front of you when you're speaking, just to make it easier for members to hear what is being said. Councillor Forbes, your question, please.
Thanks, Provost. I'm sure some people would prefer listen to the music outside than me, but that's maybe another matter. I was interested in what you said about Cooper Angus Library, because I thought what had happened there actually turned out to be quite well received and seemed to be running quite successfully. But I got the suggestion from what you said it wasn't running as well, and particularly interested in the point you made that I couldn't, for example, order a book through the online system and have it delivered there. I wasn't aware that was an issue. Could you expand a little bit on that? Because I kind of see the future of libraries much more like that, and I actually thought that was a positive step for us. Perhaps I was wrong in that.
I think it is mixed. It's always interesting when you pick up the phone and you have a very candid conversation with the manager of that space, for example, to actually figure out the footfall. So there are services available in Cooper Angus, like the mobile library has scheduled stops. There is a click and collect service which you can access. For certain members of the community, that can work. So when the library or the stock was handed over, it was a portion of stock and a lot of it was the older stock. So that now sits in the community centre in Cooper Angus. Like, you can borrow those books as well as do the click and collect. Those books are spread out over the space, but the way the community centre makes money is through renting out those rooms to the community. And the challenge there is that the books are taking up that space. So gradually they've been whittling back the collection and taking it to landfill. The community is also like, oh, we'll just bring you the books. So the community manager is also having to do, because these books aren't being borrowed, actually having to do extra runs to the dump to drop the books. That's what's happening. And then being able to search and access in that space, they're having to actually pull out. So last time I chatted with them, they removed all the non-fiction from the collection. No one was borrowing them. And I think the part that shocks me is the children aspect, because these libraries, actually, one of the biggest footfalls we have is child access to the library. So something like BookBugs, for example, which is funded by the Scottish Book Trust, by having the libraries, we get a portion of that funding for our local community. As soon as the library and professional staff go, it seems to me that BookBugs also vanishes. And that's a huge loss. And we're losing and removing that budget. So the fact that 2 children have accessed the space in the past year, from what I could understand, and they're the 2 children of the manager, kind of explains to me that something has gone wrong in the transition of that. And I also think there was a substantial gap between the library being closed and this service being opened, and there aren't necessarily the resources to signpost to the community that a library still exists, that a space still exists. And libraries in general are free spaces. So if the community centre is renting out the rooms and they're being almost a paid centre, that shifts how people use it. And the barriers, I think, to certain people, particularly in the community, from accessing that space.
And if I may just pick up on something, you referenced books being taken to landfill a couple of times there, which of course I hadn't even considered as being an option. It did make me think, with the future being, I presume, digital. I'm certainly taking more books from Perth Kinross Library digitally than I go into the library and collect. I'm wondering how you square away the kind of environmental aspects of where we go with the fact that books ultimately, however it's managed, are all going to end up in landfill at some point, or end up going through the recycling process at least. Do you not think, going back to Councillor Braun's point, that actually the future of libraries has to change? It might not actually be about paper books in the future.
I think it can be blended. I think libraries, to some extent, are also about the spaces. and what they mean, and the free space, the access to knowledge, the access to warm space, the access to someone who understands books. Like, there is something incredibly valuable. I was hearing about one child in our community who most of our libraries now also have toy collections, for example, sensory toys. They're quiet spaces. Children, particularly neurodivergent children, can access those spaces. And then they browse a book, they pick it up, they collect, but they often chat with the librarian, a qualified adult. They've known that librarian not longer than most of them have known their teachers. And they'll be like, what's the best book about aliens? What's the best book about space? And then the librarian's like, this is the book that you should borrow about space. There's incredible value about that knowledge. And there was a report by the Scottish Book Trust that looked at this love of reading and whether a child reads and what that means in terms of their educational opportunities. It is a bigger predictor of whether you succeed in higher education and job opportunities beyond that than your family background. How much you read has a huge impact. And I don't actually see children under the age of 5 picking up an ebook. Their audiobooks, I tend to agree. So I think there is a mix, and I think it is up to librarians and qualified individuals to be deciding what is in that book collection and really making the best decisions on how to spend that budget. But if one of the models on the table is how to transfer these collections over to local communities and they become volunteer-led, we also need things like access to the discount that CPK has, which these libraries don't have, and also the volunteer groups don't have. So there is a big benefit of being part of a group that's buying, and we can access, I think the collection at the moment, I looked at it, it's over 40,000 volumes, digital and otherwise, and there might only be a handful in your library, but you can order and collect, and that's the piece that's really interesting.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Allen next, please.
Thank you, Provost, and thank you, Hannah, for your presentation and answering the questions with a smile. It's quite emotive, and we're all doing our best to see what we can do to help. Now, obviously, I'm a big supporter. I've heard most of the answers to my questions, so I'm going to gear it slightly differently. You talk about community spaces, you talk about volunteers, you talk about the difficulty with fundraising and all that, and I get that. My question to you is, where do you think the libraries will go if we lose the expertise and professionalism of our librarians?
I think that's a really interesting question. The librarians, in a way, they're like the curators and anchors, and I'll speak to my own experience. I've recently moved to Perth Kinross. My family's been here for 10 years, so I used to access the Pitlochry Library, and it's great news that that library is going to be more of a central hub. But for me, moving into the Dunkeld area and accessing the Burnham Library, the librarian was the first touch point I had. She's like, you've got to access this is this group, here's that, there's the local doctor's surgery, here you go. They signpost. There's an expertise that they have not only on the books and curation of the collection, but an expertise they have on the community. And I think what's been the most heartbreaking thing for me is how throughout this consultation process from CPK, how much those librarians have not been engaged with, and how their expertise in their local communities, decades-long experience, has not been consulted with. There is no reference to that. And to be honest, they're all under constant threat of job loss. Before handing over to CPK, we had over 76 people across Perth and Kinross working on library and information services. We're down to 50. In these rural libraries, we've got 7 people who are senior library assistants. I don't know why you're an assistant if you're managing the library anyway. We also have then the casual support staff who also cover it. It's 3 full-time equivalent. It's a tiny, tiny amount we're paying these individuals to bring their decades of experience, whether it comes in the form of books and knowledge and how to access it, but also in how this community actually works. And I do think if we are to move forward with this budget, there should be a pool of funds for these librarians to access to run local engagement with their communities, to bring footfall back in, to make these spaces open, to make them more accessible, and to potentially expand their hours in partnership. Like if I look at the skills and employment group run by Perth and Kinross Council, none of them are using these rural libraries. It doesn't make sense. Why isn't there the ability to meet up with someone and talk about your CV, talk about local opportunities in these towns and communities? Why do I have to travel to Perth? I had to leave my house at 7 a.m. to be able to get here to address you on the train. Like that is the challenge. And I had to walk past the mobile libraries who are starting to get up, but the mobile library is not necessarily the solution for these spaces. And it is a misuse in a way to kind of close 5 spaces and replace it with a van. And to be honest, it's also a false economy. The last data I could find of how much mobile libraries cost us was 2013. And there was a review and it was costing us $165,000 to operate the vans as they stand. I imagine that has gone up. If you increase the number of stops and include these towns, that's only going to increase that level of the budget as you drop these fixed costs. So I don't think there's a solution necessarily there. But yes, librarians are kind of crucial to the whole process. And I think my perspective is you're getting a very good deal with the current level of expertise you're having with the opening hours of these libraries.
Thank you. Councillor Peter Barrett.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for your presentation. I'm very keen to know what you think the communities can bring to secure the future of library services and rural library services in Perth and Kinross. You mentioned the figure of £200,000 being what's required to sustain libraries, but we're confronted with savings options and budget pressures for culture, Perth and Kinross. And if we provide £200,000 to culture, Perth and Kinross and nothing else, then that's simply going to sort of transfer the cuts and the reduction in opening hours to Perth Museum and Art Gallery. I got some sort of sense that the community were up for making a contribution, and some of what you said with regard to harnessing the council's buying power and discounts of libraries. I was more concerned about what you were saying in terms of the difficulties that local library groups would have in fundraising, the onerous demands that you said that there would be in terms of volunteers to support libraries. The fact that the buildings are poorly used, and your solution was that the council should recruit and pay people to drive up library usage, rather than what are the community going to do about that, and falling back on the duty of councils to provide statutory services. But there's also a level of those services and we have to consider. And all over Perth and Kinross, we're trying to work with communities to deliver better services locally based, tapping into the resources of community to make them sustainable. So libraries aren't alone in that, but I think I need to hear a bit more from you about, we're not just going to sort of put the 449 or 500,000 pounds into libraries and the communities are going to say thank you very much, and we'll go back to the same old way until 2 years' time when we're confronted with the same savings options.
There it is. Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, I agree. We do need to be getting more value for the money that's being spent. I think one of the things, there was a recommendation in 2017 for a library strategy. There was the opening of a consultation. There was no library strategy that I can find. I've trawled the council website and CBK's website. And what's happened is it's a collective strategy around culture. And that's great because libraries are around culture, but they're around more than culture. They're about the education, the employment opportunities, and about what these spaces. And there are more limited spaces in rural communities than there are in urban centres for the community to access. And so one of the questions I have is how do we best use these funds, and what does that strategy look like, and how do these communities feed in? The start of this consultation process was these libraries are closing. It's not really defined what it means to offer adequate position. That was in the Culture Perth and Kinross slides at the community presentations. My question is, how do we define it? Can we define it? Can we define it with you? Can we define it and then take it up to national level for a review of what adequate provision means? I think we've got a really good case here with these 5 libraries, if we do invest these funds, to actually define what adequate provision means, particularly in the case of rural communities, and what it means for the future, not just in terms of books, but in terms of access to knowledge, access to digital knowledge and education opportunities. Because I think this is what these libraries can offer. And I do think there is a way for the communities to feed in and support specific aspects. and each library will have its own way forward. That I can see, but I also see there's a value in collectively going, this is what it means to have a rural library, a hub in a rural town that serves local communities. These are the groups that are best suited to access that space, support that space, potentially co-fund that space. These are the groups we should be reaching out to make sure they're there. And also, what can we rotate in these libraries? So not that they just get bigger footfall and more people borrowing books, but we have amazing investments we've made, like in the Ideas Centre in Perth, for example. There's access to 3D printers. There's things like you can access Adobe InDesign if you want to take up graphic design, but all these tools are based in Perth. Why can't we rotate those tools and those computers to rural libraries and signpost the communities to access them? Then you start to have different groups of volunteers, different portions of the community accessing those spaces. And I don't think the engagement strategy has to require necessarily new hiring. I do think there is scope to fundraise for those roles if you wanted to do it, because it's different portions of funding. But I also think you would see appetite in local communities if you go, these are the other things we want this library to offer, who can rally around these different points, whether it's for children, whether it's for education and skills, whether it's for digital inclusion. And I think one of the biggest, these libraries, some of them are only open 9.5 hours a week. Of course, they've got smaller footfall. The other thing, when you look at these numbers and you're like, has it gone up? Has it gone down? We shut a library, of course it's partially gone down. We've cut the hours. There's no record of how the hours have shrunk over time. And that's not in the data. So I think when we look at how do we engage people with these spaces, we need to be realistic about whether the door's actually open and who should be opening that door. And I think there is scope to additionally support these libraries with volunteers, and there is potential portions of funding we can get, but I think we lose the ability to even go down that path if we shut these spaces.
Thank you. Councillor Colin Stewart.
Thank you, Provost. Thank you, Hannah, for your presentation. When we were questioning the Chief Executive of Culture, Perth Kinross at the Scrutiny and Performance Committee in towards the end of last year, we asked for a follow-up in terms of some of the health and well-being benefits of libraries, the social benefit, the mental health and well-being, the support that people can find when accessing libraries. And I just wondered if you, and we got a ton of information, but I just wondered if you wanted to sort of address some of the issues around social benefit and health and well-being.
I think it's hard to have the quantifiable data because it hasn't been collected. So the library over time, I think since the decision was made, we need to consolidate, we need to shut these spaces. Since that was made, whether it was publicly announced or not several years back, the data on these libraries has really gone down. So it's hard to know, apart from footfall and borrowing, what actually the benefits are. I can tell you on a national level, the NHS kind of numbers are that it's around 3 million a year that Scotland saves for the NHS by having libraries. And one of that is the social kind of cohesion that comes from a library space. And there are points in your life when the library will matter more to you. For example, and this is not necessarily the most positive, but if you lose your partner and suddenly you're facing loneliness, and this is some of the stories that I heard back from the community, the first place you go is the library. And one, it's to find books or stories or narratives that make this less lonely, but also to talk to someone who's not going to judge you. They're not going to judge you for how much time you spend in that space. They're not going to hurry you along. They're not going to say the 15 minutes is up. They're not going to say, oh, you didn't buy a coffee. You can just go there and have a chat. And there's a lack of judgment that comes from this interaction with a librarian. And often they're like, I put this book aside for you. It's very hard to quantify those numbers. I think it could be taken on to do so. I think you could fundraise to do that. I think it would be particularly interesting to look at it in a rural context where there are less of these spaces and to work in partnership with local doctor surgeries, for example. You could also look at, can we use these spaces for group counselling sessions? Can we use them for therapy sessions? The library it has a roof, it's just locked for many, many hours.
Thank you very much. Councillor Frank Smith, final question.
Thank you, Provost, and thank you, Hannah, very much for your presentation there. I fall into the category of reading when I was younger, missed the middle out, and now I'm reading more than ever. What I would like to say is that I have a constituent who's 91-year-old, and she relies very much on a service from the library for her books. And to be quite honest, it keeps her alive because she really does enjoy it. My question to you would be, in the rural situation, is that service available, and is it costed in? Thank you.
From my understanding, the service is available. It relies again on volunteers. So I think this is a really good example of when you have core library services and then you have volunteers. I think it's a big ask for volunteers to be driving a 40-minute round trip to pick up books for like my neighbour's 97, for example. If I have to walk across the bridge 10 minutes and pick up books for her, fine. If I have to drive 40 minutes, that's a big ask on a volunteer and their petrol budget. So there's this kind of piece, and I think those kind of services are crucial. And the other thing is, like, I think any forward planning of what a library means for its community should involve also surveying some of those individuals. So it was with the survey process that happened, there were 1,500 responses, there were 15 questions, there were noticeable groups left out. So one, library users who maybe aren't accessing the space but rely on the space in order to get their books and reading materials or audiobooks. There was no surveys done of the children accessing these spaces. Families were counted, but it was in direct contrast to how other council engagement has happened, for example. So Jubilee Park in Burnham, people from the council went into the school, asked the kids what they would like to see, how would they use the space. There was a real moment of taking their inputs. This didn't happen in the library process. The children who are some of the biggest users of these spaces were not asked how they felt about the closure, how they value the space, how they feel about their librarian. And it's similar for these groups who maybe are no longer able to access the space. Digital library members also weren't consulted. So there's a lot of people who can't access the library because of the hours they're open, their working hours, particularly in communities that rely on tourism. So they're open when the tourists are there, which is also incidentally when the libraries are open Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And they're not able to get to the library. So they're using the digital resources, but they weren't necessarily part of the survey. They weren't actively sent the survey. In order to access the survey, you often had to go into the library space. So I would say that survey didn't really capture those needs. And that's the process. If we are going to spend this money, how are we going to capture those community groups and get the best value for the full life cycle of the library user?
Thank you very much. Councillor Smith, a very quick follow-up if you wish.
I would just like to say that she asked me to say today to thank the library service for keeping her alive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms Wicks, for answering all those questions very competently. You may now resume to the public gallery. Thank you very much. Members, that concludes the first part of today's meeting, which was hearing the petitioners. As with the previous petition, questions to officers will be addressed in the next part when the council paper is moved. We're now going to have a recess break for 30 minutes and we will return at 10 to 11. So that's 10:50 to return. Thank you.